Thanks for inviting me. Just a brief intro into my work. So I'm an assistant professor in VQV here at Nanyang Tech, and my primary interests lie in the impact of new media on politics. More recently, I've been investigating the effects of AI on politics, which includes public opinion of AI tech and socio-political impacts of deepfakes. So the findings I present today are part of a larger project. So before we begin, I want to play a short clip.
Democracy is a fragile thing. More fragile than you want to believe. If the election fails, there is no democracy. I don't have to do anything. You're doing it to yourselves. People are divided. Your voting districts are manipulated. Voting locations are closing, so millions can't vote. It's not hard for democracy to collapse. All you have to do is nothing.
So what you saw is a public awareness ad created to raise awareness against deepfakes. The ad was supposed to go on air in the US before the recent elections in November, but all networks pulled out without giving a reason, though many feel that networks pulled out because the video is too real. This is a glimpse of how close deepfakes can get to reality. In formal terms, deepfakes refer to manipulated videos or other digital representations produced by sophisticated AI that yield fabricated images and sound that appear to be real. In other words, it's fake news in a video form, but perhaps more lethal than text or images. More recently, we have seen a number of deepfakes go viral, including a series on Tom Cruise. While we do find most of these deepfakes to be funny and entertaining, we have also seen deepfakes of President Obama hurling abuses at President Trump or Mark Zuckerberg admitting to manipulating millions of Facebook users. Now, these were created as awareness ads, but again, they raise the concerns regarding the potential impact of deepfakes on democracies worldwide. Deepfakes are dangerous because of how good they are. Social media users are more likely to trust images and audio rather than text as a more reliable depiction of the real world. This is the realism heuristic. So as the tech behind deepfakes progresses, they can become more convincing, amplifying the consequences of disinformation. Deepfakes are also dangerous because of the alibi they give to liars. This is the liar's dividend. Individuals can now plausibly deny the authenticity of factual content. For instance, during the 2016 US presidential campaign, the Access Hollywood video surfaced where we heard President Trump use vulgar language to describe women. He later went on to say that the audio clip was doctored. This is a classical use of the liar's dividend. What this means is that we can become less trustful of actual facts. Now that we understand why deepfakes are dangerous, we have to understand who is at risk and how does the public engage with deepfakes. So today I'll cover these three questions. The first question is, who is aware of deepfakes? Since deepfakes is a fairly recent phenomenon, it's first important to understand the level of public awareness regarding deepfakes before delving into other details. Next, we need to know who is likely to fall for deepfakes and accidentally share them on social media. This is important since disinformation sharing, whether intentional or accidental, just amplifies the reach. Finally, what happens if deepfakes are shared? We do need to understand the consequences of public engagement with deepfakes. So I've devoted the last year and a half in answering these questions. So let's start with the first one. Who is aware of deepfakes? So the study was done on a nationally representative panel of citizens in Singapore. So the first thing we notice is that approximately 1 in 2 individuals is aware of deepfakes. So the awareness is around 54%. In terms of characteristics, who is likely to be more aware of deepfakes? Not surprisingly, we notice that those who are frequent news consumers and interested in politics are more aware of deepfakes. So you see the blue bar is those who are aware, the orange bar is those who are not aware, the statistical comparisons and cohort results, so it's all statistically significant. So we see here that those who are aware of deepfakes are frequent social media news users, traditional media news users, and have higher levels of political interest. So I benchmarked these findings against the US sample since deepfakes are more widely discussed in the public domain in the US. So the level of awareness is a bit higher compared to Singapore. So it's 54 versus 61.4. But in terms of characteristics, we observe the same patterns, that those who are aware of deepfakes are frequent social media news users, traditional media news users, and have higher levels of political interest as compared to those who are not aware of deepfakes. Now, compared to US, both the levels of exposure and concerns were less in Singapore. So here we have the blue bar is deepfakes exposure, the orange bar is deepfake concern. On the right panel, you see the US, and on the left, Singapore. So in Singapore, you have deepfakes exposure and concerns a bit less compared to US, but again, these are at moderate level because the scale runs from 1 to 5. Next, I look at the third-person perception. So the third-person perceptual hypothesis, as we know, predicts that individuals will perceive media messages to have greater effects on other people than on themselves. So for example, if we were to ask individuals, do you think that you are affected by violent movies? Most would say, no, I don't get influenced. But when we ask them, do you think others are affected? They might say yes, or maybe they do get affected. So I examined third-person perception in terms of deepfakes influence, and this is what we observe here. When individuals in both countries were asked how likely is it that deepfakes can impact your opinions, most people said that others are more vulnerable than them. So here we see the left panel is Singapore, the right is US, the blue bar is deepfakes can influence others' opinion, the orange bar is can it influence your opinions. And again, these are t-test statistical significance in terms of comparison. So in both countries, we observe that there is obviously a bias here, where individuals think that they are more protected than others in society. Now, I also examined first-person perception, and I asked them, do you think you can recognize deepfakes more frequently than others? And again, we see support for first-person perception also, as the blue bar is can you recognize deepfakes, and orange is can others. And again, for both Singapore and US, we see that individuals feel that they can recognize deepfakes more frequently as compared to others. So just to sum up this section, there are three key takeaways. The first is that news consumers and those who are politically interested are more likely to be aware of deepfakes. And the deepfakes awareness in the population level is approximately 1 in 2 individuals. Next, people are moderately concerned and sometimes do exposed to deepfakes. And individuals feel that they are less vulnerable, so it cannot impact their opinions as much as it can impact others in society. But they also feel that they can identify deepfakes more frequently than others. So we observe a clear-cut first-person perception and third-person perception biases. All right, let's move to the next question, which asks who is likely to accidentally share a deepfake. So given the time, I won't be getting into the analytical models, but I'll present an overview of the findings. So individuals were asked if they had ever shared a deepfake accidentally that they later found out was a hoax. And we see that 1 in 3 individuals said that yes, they had shared a deepfake that they later found out was a hoax. And again, just to clarify that this is not the overall sample, but only those who are aware of deepfakes. In terms of characteristics, we find that the odds of accidentally sharing a deepfake increases with increased exposure to deepfakes, not surprising. But we also observe that those who are politically interested and those who belong to lower cognitive ability, so those with a lower level of general intelligence, are more vulnerable to sharing these deepfakes. And the cognitive ability was measured through the word-sum test. But besides this, I also find that the likelihood of politically interested citizens sharing deepfakes intensifies in more extensive social networks. So citizens with higher, as we observe in the graph here, the moderation effect, that the likelihood of politically interested citizens sharing deepfake increases in more extensive networks. So here the low political interest, high political interest. The dotted line is larger social network. The gray line is the biggest social network. So why would this happen? So we know that citizens with high political interest are more involved and informed about public and political affairs than others. And they're often found to be self-identified opinion leaders. So I speculate that when these individuals receive new information, novel information in the form of deepfake, they are motivated to share such content without the realization of its manipulative nature within the networks. So this would also be possible that they are trying to gain more social influence in a more extensive network, and they end up accidentally sharing deepfakes which they don't realize that it's a fake. All right, just to wrap up this section. So the key takeaway for the question who's likely to share deepfakes, we see that those who are frequently exposed to deepfakes, politically interested users, and their likelihood of sharing deepfakes increases in bigger social networks. All right, with that, let's discuss the possible implications of deepfake engagement. So I'll focus on two studies here, and the two possible consequences are that deepfakes can deceive you and can also turn you into a news skeptic. So you remember this slide where individuals in both Singapore and US said that they can recognize deepfakes more frequently than others. Well, I tested them on their assumptions. So what you see on screen is one is an AI generated face of a person that doesn't exist on planet Earth. The other is a real human being. So I use the which face is real inventory by Western Bergstrom. So the website allows you, and the inventory allows you to pick up from two faces. One is a photo of a real person and the other is an AI generated face of a person who doesn't exist on Earth. So the fake face utilizes neural network generated artificial fake images. So more details can be found at this link. Okay, so what I found was that only 1 in 4 people got all the 4 answers right, and nearly half of them got just 2 answers right out of the 4 set. But most importantly, I use regression models to check if first-person perception, so the assumption that I can recognize deepfakes more frequently than others in society, is true or not. And as you would guess, it's not. So no statistical significance was found in the relationship between first-person perception and recognition of these artificially generated fake images. Also, individuals across high and low FPP levels were equally likely to miss recognizing these deepfakes images. I also compared it to the third-person perception. So can deepfakes influence you more than others? And again, no effects were found. So no statistical significance between FPP and, between TPP, third-person perception, and recognizing real or fake face was found. So to sum, these results suggest that everyone is vulnerable to being deceived by deepfakes irrespective of their perceptions. So most of us are vulnerable. So that's the first finding. Let's talk about skepticism. So at the broader level, this study focuses on the following concepts. So this is what I'm interested in as to how are these concepts related to social media news skepticism. So I look at social media news use, public concern regarding deepfakes, the exposure to and sharing of deepfakes, inadvertent sharing, so accidental sharing, and their cognitive ability. I also look at the few moderation effects. Given the time, I'm not going to focus on the main effects, but we'll concentrate more on the moderation effects. And again, this study is forthcoming, it's accepted at New Media and Society. The citation is included at the bottom of the screen. So to understand social media news skepticism, we should first understand media skepticism. Media skepticism is defined as the subjective well-being of alienation and mistrust towards mainstream media. So it is a degree to which citizens doubt and distrust the information presented by journalists and newsmakers. In other words, individuals who exhibit media skepticism often question the accuracy of media content before they decide to believe the information. So in general, skeptics do not merely believe any information they are exposed to until they have investigated the credibility of such information. However, heightened skepticism levels may turn into cynicism, which is associated with the rejection of information and news disengagement. So I posit the hypothesis here that those who are concerned about the influence of deepfakes in society will be skeptical about news content on social media, since social media is the primary avenue where deepfakes propagate. So concerns regarding deepfakes will be positively associated with social media news skepticism, right? That's a direct relation I hypothesize. Beyond the direct effects, and there are other direct effects in the paper, but we're not getting there. So beyond this direct effect, it is also possible that inadvertent or accidental sharing might interact with deepfake concern in explaining social media news skepticism. So I posit that those who have greater concerns regarding deepfakes would have higher involvement than those who are not as concerned. So when the highly concerned individuals accidentally share deepfakes, they would consider it as a failure, as their action would go against their psychological comfort. So based on the role of involvement in self-serving bias, we would expect these individuals to use external attributions and blame social media news environment, than attributing the accountability to themselves. So, but because this question has not been previously explored, I propose it as a research question and not as a hypothesis. So the research question is, does inadvertent sharing behavior moderate the relationship between deepfake concerns and social media news skepticism? Next, given the earlier goal of examining the moderating effect of inadvertent or accidental sharing, I also look at how it is logical to inquire as to how does cognitive ability interacts with this process. So a final research question is proposed that does cognitive ability moderate the conditional influence of inadvertent deepfake sharing behavior in the relationship between deepfake concern and social media news skepticism? Given the time, I'm not getting into the method, so if you're interested, you can just pause the screen and check the details. So here's the survey details, here are the core variables, how they were measured. Okay, let's go to the findings. So these are the other direct effects in the paper. So we see that social media news use is negatively related to social media news skepticism. Both concern and exposure are positively related to skepticism, but inadvertent sharing is not. Okay, but our interest is in the first moderation question. Does inadvertent sharing moderate the relationship between deepfake concern and social media news skepticism? And this is what we find, right? So what happens when those who are concerned accidentally share deepfakes? So those who are worried about deepfake should be skeptical of news on social media. We saw that in the direct relationship. Now what I'm asking at the next step is, what if those who are worried about deepfake accidentally share them? How does that influence this skepticism? And this is what we observe in the moderation effects. So those who are more concerned about deepfakes with high concern, if they accidentally share it, so this is the blue bar is the sharing one, if they accidentally share it, they are found to have higher levels of skepticism as compared to those who have not shared it, or even with those with low concerns, right? So we see the statistical significance of the moderation effect. Now, next I looked at the cognitive ability. In terms of the direct effect, cognitive ability is positively associated with social media news skepticism. So those who belong to the higher cognitive ability groups are more skeptical of the social media news environment. So next, I look at the moderated moderation. So the findings suggest that here, the moderated moderation findings suggest that when concerned individuals accidentally share deepfake, their skepticism increases. But this happens only for low and mid cognitive groups and not for high cognitive groups. So while some might say that being a skeptic is good, we have to be a bit cautious. So this finding potentially identifies a resistance mechanism in effect that protects these individuals, so those who belong to low and mid cognitive groups, from deepfakes, but also suggests that these individuals, when fooled once, are going to doubt perhaps even real news, because we observe heightened skepticism here, jumping from a level of 3 to above 6, measured from a scale of 1 to 7. So there's a likelihood that heightened skepticism can quickly transform into generalized news cynicism. Now, this is problematic because social media is a primary source of news, not just in the United States, but in a number of countries across the world. So if users are no more sure of real news, then it's perhaps a bad sign for democracy. So what both these studies show is that deepfakes can deceive you, but it can also sow in news distrust that can transform into news skepticism and perhaps cynicism. So having answered all these questions, where do we go from here? So we have covered who is aware of deepfake, who's likely to share them, and what are the possible implications. So based on the finding, we come to the conclusion that disinformation in the form of deepfakes can not only deceive you, but can sow in news distrust that can transform into skepticism and perhaps cynicism. And we've also identified that low cognitive groups are most vulnerable. So the threat posed by deepfakes tech has serious systemic implications. So the development of the tech can undermine the trust people have in established government, but it can also undermine the trust they have in each other, and as we observed here, in the news environment. Now, the research on deepfakes engagement is preliminary. The evidence I've presented today from the last 1.5 years that I've spent researching this topic, but there's not enough empirical evidence out there at this point of time. So the research is preliminary. So we need more efforts to evaluate and understand public engagement with deepfake. But based on the findings that I've presented today and the evidence that we have gone through, it's a bit concerning. And especially given the fact that social media acts as a primary news platform for millions of citizens. Okay, if you have any questions, please drop me an email. My details are on screen. Thank you so much for listening.